So let's go back to some of your views from, because you're from Zambia and then you came here and you got a master's in public administration. And I recall you'd written a paper with what might sound like heterodox views on foreign aid. So, and we didn't get like really deep into that in the past, but it was something that kind of interested me because from what I understood of your views is that they weren't immediately self-serving. So I kind of wanted to hear more of your views on foreign aid.
So Dustin, I'll put this out there, and I want to make sure that both you and your viewers understand my perspective on this. You know, I've lived in Kansas City for about 16 years. It'll be a complete 16 years this December. And most of the views I offer and my perspective about matters on the continent of Africa are a little skewed because I've been here for 16 years. Have I traveled back and gone back home? Yes, but that is different from those who actually live and breathe African air 24/7, 365 days of the year. I don't. You know, I get to pop in and out. I'm here in Kansas City. So my view is my view and my view alone, and is my perspective.
Well, I was going to ask if your views would be considered controversial.
To some, they might be, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. So let's dive in. When it comes to foreign aid, I'm highly suspicious of foreign aid the way it's packaged in today's terms. And what do I mean by that? You know, the old saying, you can say it better than me. Is it better to give a man a fish and feed him for a day, or teach him how to fish so he can survive for the rest of his life? I butchered that, by the way, but you get the gist of it. The problem I have with foreign aid is foreign aid is taxpayer money from the United States. Now, in the beginning of this conversation, I talked about 4 out of 10 Americans are technically living in poverty, but they pay their taxes. Sales tax, property tax, they pay all kinds of taxes. The federal government takes that money, you know, gives the majority of it to the military-industrial complex, and does other things with it. Funds healthcare, that's one of the biggest parts of the United States federal government's budget. And then there's a small little percentage that's dedicated to foreign aid to help those in need, countries like Zambia and many countries on the continent of Africa, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So you have poor folk here who are paying their taxes. Their government in turn takes that money and sends it over in terms of resources and money to foreign governments in Africa. The problem is most of those funds don't make it to the starving kids you see on those ads. When you see the starving kid ads, most of those kids don't end up receiving that money. I'll tell you where that money goes. Again, my opinion here. And a lot of people have done research, and I did research on this as well, ends up in the hands of some of the most corrupt governments on the continent of Africa. My problem with foreign aid is threefold. It props up bad actors. So when we donate money and give money to my fellow brothers and sisters who need the resources, when we send that money to countries in Africa, does our government really verify and check to find out if these governments are following democratic, small letter D, practices? Are we really investing the time to know if these governments are corrupt or not? Are we really investing the time to find out how much for every dollar, how much actually gets in the hands of those starving kids, those mothers who need help? We don't. So we're propping up bad governments because we're just giving out money. There are governments in sub-Saharan Africa whose entire budget, majority of it, a good portion of it, relies on foreign aid. How could that be? Africa, believe it or not, folks, is the world's richest continent in terms of resources. But we have the poorest countries economically. But we still keep sending money. It's believed since the late 70s, since African countries became independent from the 1950s onward, the United States government has spent trillions of dollars on the continent of Africa. And what has that brought us? The life expectancy in Africa is still the lowest in the world. We still have people who go on living on $1 a day. How are we holding those governments accountable? We're not. So we're propping up bad governments. Number two, a lot of the foreign aid that you see, even with the nonprofits, they mean well. And I'm sure some lives are being saved. But part of it are these feel-good projects that people are doing. Have you ever seen the average American person who is doing missionary work and goes to the continent of Africa? Half the time they're there to get a selfie. Look at this picture, me, white person, with all these starving black kids. I'm saving lives. I wrote articles on that. I got a question to people who do that. By the way, that bothers the shit out of me. Excuse my language. Why not do that here? Why don't you go find minority communities here and take those pictures and help your own here before you try and go across the world and help others? So again, a lot of these foreign aid projects are feel-good projects for the average American. Look at what I'm doing. I'm saving somebody. Somebody who was going without is now eating. We don't know if that's really the case. So propping up bad governments, feel-good projects, and then we're destroying economies. What do I mean by that, you might ask? So let's say, and I love Bill and Melinda Gates, and without them, thousands, maybe even millions would have died without the efforts they've made on the continent of Africa. But I got a question for them. Let's say the Bill, and this is hypothetical, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation decide to donate hundreds upon hundreds of mosquito nets to people on the continent of Africa. Why mosquito nets? Because malaria is one of the biggest, or at least when I was growing up, was one of the biggest diseases on the continent. And one way to prevent malaria is by investing in mosquito nets so that when people go to bed, mosquitoes don't bite them, and then that way blood is not being moved from one person to another through the mosquitoes. You're preventing the spread of malaria with mosquito nets in simple terms. So if the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation decide to flood the Zambian market with mosquito nets that were made in China or made here in Kansas City and send them to Zambia, the question I have for you, Dustin, what happens to the local mosquito net manufacturer in Zambia? Because America is coming in and donating this stuff for free. What happens to the guy who's trying to build his business? Forget mosquito nets, donating bags of rice. Much needed. There are people starving, and without those donations from the United Nations, they'll be dead. But what happens to the local rice farmer? What happens to his produce, his output? What happens to that woman who is a subsistence farmer who's growing her own crops? Where can she sell her crops when people are receiving stuff for free? So you're destroying economies, and it's not deliberate, it's inadvertent. You're creating these feel-good projects where people feel good, like, oh, I saved somebody today, when you're really not in the long term. And then you're propping up bad governments. That's just my philosophy, and that's what that paper was about. And I know people will comment and disagree and say, that's rich coming from you, I'm now in the United States. Do people need help? Absolutely. But I'm interested in long-term fixes, not short-term fixes. Yeah, you fed people for today, but what's gonna happen next year's drought? Or 5 years from now's drought? Are we going to continue throwing bags of rice from these airlifted planes? What are we doing here, Dustin? So I just want to put that out there. You can chime in now.